Daniel Brooks woke before sunrise the same way he always did, not by alarm, but by habit carved deep into years of responsibility. The small apartment in South Chicago was still half dark, the kind of dim light that clung to peeling walls and quiet sacrifices. In the next room, his son Noah Brooks, 7 years old, slept curled under a faded blue blanket, one arm resting over a school backpack that had been left too close to the bed again. Daniel moved carefully, avoiding the loose floorboard near the kitchen sink. The smell of yesterday's coffee still lingered in the air, bitter and thin, like time stretched too far. At 38, Daniel had learned how to live quietly in a world that rarely made space for men like him. A black single father, a maintenance technician at a downtown logistics facility, he worked double shifts when needed, never complained, never raised his voice unless Noah was laughing. That laughter mattered more than anything else. It was the reason he fixed broken things for strangers during the day and came home to fix dinner with tired hands at night. On the table sat a small lunchbox Noah had decorated with stickers, uneven, colorful, stubbornly bright against their modest kitchen. Daniel paused for a moment, staring at it, as if it carried the weight of everything he had not yet solved in life. Then he exhaled quietly, put on his worn jacket, and picked up his old toolbox. Outside, the morning air was cold enough to sting. His pickup truck, an aging black Ford with fading paint and a stubborn engine, waited at the curb like an old memory that refused to disappear. Something felt wrong that morning, though Daniel couldn't say why. It wasn't the sky, it was too clear for concern. It wasn't the road, it was too empty for suspicion. It was something quieter, deeper, like the world holding its breath without telling him why. Then he noticed it. A message on his phone from his supervisor, urgent request, immediate assignment, location, Whitmore Grand Hotel, downtown Chicago. High-profile client. No further details. Daniel didn't like assignments without details. They usually meant rich people, fragile egos, and invisible rules that changed without warning. But he looked back at the apartment window once, where Noah's silhouette shifted slightly in sleep, and made his decision without hesitation. He drove through the city as it slowly woke, passing glass towers that reflected people like him as afterthoughts. The Whitmore Grand Hotel rose at the center like a polished monument to another world, marble entrance, black SUVs lining the driveway, staff moving with rehearsed precision. Inside the lobby, everything smelled faintly of expensive perfume and polished wood, the kind of place where silence was not absence but expectation. And that was when she appeared. Charlotte Whitmore. A billionaire CEO, known for her precision more than her warmth, stepped into the private dining corridor with her son Noah beside her. She was elegant in a restrained, controlled way, white tailored dress, minimal jewelry, posture like architecture built to withstand pressure. Her attention was already divided between her phone and the child walking half a step behind her. Noah didn't speak. He rarely did in public anymore. Something in his silence had become heavier over time, as if the world had asked too much of him too early. Charlotte called it a phase. The doctors called it emotional withdrawal. She called it manageable. Daniel noticed none of that at first. He only saw a child holding on to silence like it was the only thing he could control. The assignment was simple: check the HVAC unit near the private dining suite. Fix what needed fixing. Leave without disruption. But when Daniel stepped into the corridor, carrying his old toolbox, something shifted. The boy looked up. Just once. And in that brief moment, something unspoken passed between them, not recognition, not trust, but something closer to understanding without language. Charlotte noticed it too. Her gaze sharpened slightly, evaluating Daniel the way she evaluated boardrooms and contracts, quick, precise, cautious. "Maintenance is down the hall," she said without stopping. Her voice was calm, but distant, as if distance itself was part of her authority. Daniel nodded respectfully. "Yes, ma'am," he replied. No resistance. No extra words. Just the quiet discipline of someone who had learned not to take space where it wasn't offered. But as he passed them, Noah dropped his napkin. It fell softly onto the marble floor, sliding just near Daniel's boot. Daniel stopped. Bent down. Picked it up. A simple act. Nothing more. But when he looked up to hand it back, Noah was watching him, not at his clothes, not at his title, but at his hands. Grease-stained slightly from earlier work, steady, careful, unhurried. Something in the boy's expression changed, subtle but undeniable. Charlotte noticed the shift immediately. Her eyes narrowed, not in anger, but in calculation. She had built her world on reading people quickly, and something about this interaction did not fit her expectations. "Thank you," she said, though the words felt automatic, not warm. Daniel gave a small nod and continued walking. But something felt wrong, not dangerous, not loud, just unresolved. Like a note left hanging in a silent room. And behind him, Noah turned his head slightly, watching him leave longer than necessary. She kept watching too. Before we go deeper into what he discovered that day, tell us where you're watching from and do not forget to subscribe, because what happened next changed the way everyone looked at him. Daniel reached the maintenance door, set down his toolbox, and opened it slowly. Inside, the system panel blinked irregularly, too clean for failure, too precise for coincidence. Then he noticed it. A calibration code mismatched by a pattern he had seen once before, years ago, in a job that was supposed to be impossible to forget but had somehow been erased from his life by time and silence. He stared at it longer than he should have. Something about it didn't belong here. Something about it belonged to a different story entirely. And in the dining corridor behind him, Charlotte Whitmore looked down at her son again and realized, for the first time, that he was still watching the maintenance man like he already knew something she did not. Charlotte Whitmore did not like uncertainty. It disrupted structure, and structure was how she controlled her world. In the private dining corridor of the Whitmore Grand Hotel, she adjusted her son Noah Whitmore's posture with a light touch on his shoulder, her eyes already scanning ahead for the next meeting waiting on her schedule. Noah followed without protest, but his silence had become heavier in recent months, like a room slowly losing air. He did not look at the chandeliers or the polished marble beneath his shoes. He looked at people instead, in ways Charlotte could not fully interpret anymore. Daniel Brooks had already moved deeper into the maintenance corridor, toolbox in hand, step steady and unremarkable. He was used to not being noticed. That was not new. What was new was the way the child had looked at him. Not fear. Not curiosity alone. Something quieter, as if recognition had passed through him without permission. Inside the service hall, fluorescent lights hummed with a steady, indifferent rhythm. Daniel opened the maintenance panel and began inspecting the HVAC system. His movements were precise, almost mechanical, shaped by years of repairing systems that other people depended on but rarely understood. Something felt wrong almost immediately. The panel was too clean for its reported issue. The wiring pattern showed recent adjustments that did not match the hotel's maintenance logs. He paused, eyes narrowing slightly, then continued working without changing his expression. Behind him, the corridor remained active with distant footsteps and muted conversations. Luxury always sounded like restraint. Charlotte entered the adjacent lounge with Noah beside her. The room was designed for silence disguised as elegance. Soft lighting, neutral tones, expensive seating arranged at precise angles. She finally allowed herself to look down at her son. "You are quiet tonight," she said evenly. Noah did not respond at first. His fingers rested on the edge of the table, tracing invisible lines across the polished surface. Then he spoke softly, almost unsure of his own voice. "The man in the hallway." Charlotte glanced up from her phone. "What about him?" "He looked like he knew what I was thinking," Noah said. The words lingered in the air longer than they should have. Charlotte studied him carefully now, her professional composure tightening slightly. "That is not possible," she replied. But her tone carried less certainty than before. In the maintenance corridor, Daniel tightened a connection inside the panel and felt a brief irregular surge in the system response. Not failure exactly. Interference. He had seen this kind of irregularity once before in a completely different environment, under circumstances he did not allow himself to revisit. He closed the panel slowly. Then he noticed it. A small reflection on the metal edge of the unit showed part of the adjacent lounge through a half-open divider door. Noah was still watching him. Still. Not moving. Not distracted. Just watching with an intensity that did not belong to a child who was supposed to be lost in silence. Daniel held still for a moment, then returned to his work. No reaction. No acknowledgement. Discipline mattered more than curiosity. But the moment stayed with him anyway. Charlotte stood now near the window of the lounge, her reflection layered against the city skyline. Lights of Chicago stretched outward like a map of decisions she had already made and could not undo. She spoke without turning. Is something bothering you about that man? Noah hesitated. No, he said, then corrected himself after a pause. I do not know. That answer unsettled her more than certainty would have. Outside the glass, the city continued moving, unaware of the small shift happening inside a hotel corridor where a maintenance worker and a silent child had crossed paths in a way neither fully understood yet. Daniel finished the inspection and stepped back from the panel. The system was stable, but the irregularity remained unexplained. He closed his toolbox, shoulders still calm, face unreadable. Something about this job no longer felt routine, though he would not name it. Not yet. In the lounge, Noah finally looked away from the corridor. Charlotte placed her hand lightly on his back, guiding him forward toward their private suite. We will have dinner now, she said softly, as if redirecting the world back into order. But as they walked, Noah glanced once more over his shoulder. Daniel was gone from view. Still, the feeling remained. As if something had already shifted without asking permission. And somewhere deeper in the building, the maintenance system flickered once, briefly, then stabilized again, as though nothing had ever happened. Daniel Brooks finished the maintenance inspection earlier than expected, but the feeling that lingered inside him refused to follow the logic of completed work. The HVAC system was running within acceptable parameters, yet the irregularity he had noticed still echoed faintly in his mind, like a note slightly off-key in an otherwise perfect song. He closed his toolbox carefully and stepped out into the corridor again, adjusting the strap over his shoulder with calm precision. Around him, the Whitmore Grand Hotel continued its quiet performance of wealth and control. Waiters moved like shadows trained not to disturb the air. Guests spoke in lowered tones as if sound itself had a price. Daniel was used to being invisible in places like this. It was safer that way. Noah Whitmore sat in the private lounge beside his mother, his hands resting still on the edge of the table. Charlotte Whitmore had already shifted her focus back to her phone, answering messages with the efficiency of someone who never allowed silence to become too long. Yet Noah was no longer fully present in the room. His attention drifted again toward the corridor where Daniel had been moments earlier. Charlotte noticed eventually. She always noticed everything that could affect control. Noah, she said gently, though her tone carried quiet authority, finish your water. He obeyed, but slowly. Then, after a pause that felt heavier than it should have, he spoke again. He did not look at me like I was broken. Charlotte paused mid-scroll. That sentence did not belong in her structured world. She lowered her phone slightly. Who are you talking about? Noah hesitated, as if unsure whether naming it would make it real. The man from the hallway. Charlotte exhaled softly through her nose, not frustration, but analysis. She had spent years interpreting people in rooms like this, investors, executives, competitors. Children were supposed to be simpler. Predictable. But Noah had become less predictable lately, and that concerned her more than she admitted. He is maintenance staff, she said carefully. He is not part of our world. Noah looked down at his hands. Maybe that is why it felt different. Charlotte did not respond immediately. The words landed somewhere she did not fully examine. Instead, she stood, smoothing the line of her dress, reclaiming her composure like armor. "We are leaving after dinner," she said. In the corridor beyond the lounge, Daniel had returned briefly to verify a secondary panel near the service junction. The hotel's internal systems were layered, overly complex for efficiency, designed more for prestige than function. He understood systems like this well enough to know when design outweighed necessity. Something about the configuration still felt off, not dangerous, but intentional in a way that did not match maintenance logic. Then he noticed it. A second technician log had been signed off earlier that day, but the handwriting pressure, the timestamp spacing, and the access pattern did not align with standard hotel procedure. Daniel frowned slightly, then stopped himself. He was not here to investigate. He was here to work. Still, the observation remained. Behind a partially frosted glass divider, he could see movement in the lounge again. Noah had stood up from his seat. Charlotte reached for his hand immediately, guiding him with practiced ease, but the boy hesitated just long enough to look back toward the corridor once more. Their eyes did not meet this time. Still, something passed through that distance, subtle and unspoken. Daniel turned away first. Not because he was avoiding anything, but because he understood boundaries that were never spoken aloud. He tightened his grip on the toolbox and continued walking toward the service exit. Charlotte, meanwhile, felt an unfamiliar unease settle beneath her composed exterior. It was not fear. It was disruption without cause. She glanced once more at the corridor where the maintenance worker had been, now empty, then at her son, who remained unusually quiet even as they prepared to leave. "You are overthinking things," she said softly, more to herself than to him. Noah did not answer. And in that silence, something subtle began to take shape between them, not yet understood, not yet named, but no longer avoidable. Outside the hotel windows, Chicago's evening lights began to rise, reflecting across the glass like fragmented thoughts waiting to be assembled. Daniel stepped out into the cooler air, unaware that inside the building, a small shift in perception had already begun to change the way he was being seen. The night air outside the Whitmore Grand Hotel carried a sharpness that contrasted the controlled warmth inside its marble walls. Daniel Brooks stepped down from the service entrance, adjusting the strap of his worn toolbox as he merged into the sidewalk flow of Chicago's evening crowd. Neon reflections stretched across wet pavement, bending into fractured colors under passing taxis. He paused briefly near the curb, checking his phone. No messages. No emergencies. Just the quiet confirmation that his shift was over. But something in his chest remained unsettled, not from exhaustion, but from observation. Inside the hotel, Charlotte Whitmore had already guided Noah into the private vehicle waiting at the entrance. A black SUV with tinted windows idled silently, its engine barely audible, as if even sound was expected to behave differently in her presence. Charlotte sat beside her son in the back seat, posture straight, composed, her attention split between a tablet and the subtle awareness of Noah's silence. He had not spoken since leaving the lounge. That concerned her more than she allowed herself to admit. The driver closed the door gently, and the vehicle pulled away from the entrance, blending into the slow rhythm of the city. Noah stared out the window, watching lights pass in streaks. Charlotte finally lowered her device. "You are unusually quiet tonight," she said, voice measured, careful not to sound like concern. Noah did not respond immediately. His reflection hovered faintly against the glass, overlapping with the city outside. Then he spoke, almost as if testing whether the thought still made sense. "The man from the hotel, he was not afraid of me." Charlotte turned slightly toward him. "No one is afraid of you, Noah." But even as she said it, something inside her hesitated, a fraction of uncertainty she refused to acknowledge fully. Noah shook his head once. "That is not what I mean." Silence filled the vehicle again, heavier now. Charlotte looked forward, watching the road, her mind beginning to categorize the statement as emotional distortion, fatigue, or imagination. But none of those explanations fully settled. Meanwhile, Daniel walked 2 blocks before stopping at a small intersection where streetlights flickered against damp asphalt. He shifted the toolbox to his other hand and exhaled slowly. The interaction at the hotel refused to fade. Not because it was unusual in appearance, but because of what was absent from it. Fear. Resistance. Expectation. Especially from the child. Something felt wrong, though he could not define its shape. He continued walking toward the train station, passing storefronts closing for the night, their glass surfaces reflecting fragments of his movement. Inside his jacket pocket, his phone vibrated briefly. A message from Noah's school calendar reminder system had synced incorrectly to his work profile again. He frowned slightly, corrected it, and continued walking. At home, the small apartment awaited him with familiar silence. A single lamp remained on near the kitchen table where Noah Brooks had left a half-finished drawing earlier that morning. Daniel glanced at it briefly as he set down the toolbox. It was simple, unfinished, but intentional. Lines drawn carefully, as if the act of creating it had required more thought than usual. He did not study it long. He never did. But tonight, his eyes lingered a moment longer than necessary before he turned away to prepare something warm to eat. Across the city, Charlotte Whitmore's vehicle slowed at a traffic light, the interior bathed in passing neon. Noah pressed his hand lightly against the glass. "Do you think people can be wrong about what they see?" he asked. Charlotte paused, her gaze fixed ahead. "People are often wrong," she said. "That is why we rely on facts." Noah did not respond. The light turned green, and the car moved forward. But the question remained suspended in the air between them, unresolved and quietly expanding. Daniel sat at his kitchen table later that night, eating in silence. The apartment was still, but his mind was not. He replayed the hotel corridor, the maintenance panel, the child's gaze. He had seen many things in his life that did not fit immediately into explanation, but this felt different. Not alarming. Not clear. Just incomplete. Outside, Chicago continued its rhythm, unaware of the subtle threads beginning to tighten across separate lives that had briefly intersected without permission. And somewhere, in a glass-walled room high above the city, Charlotte Whitmore found herself glancing once more at her son, noticing for the first time that his silence no longer felt empty, but full of something she had not yet learned how to name. Daniel Brooks woke earlier than usual the next morning, though nothing in his schedule required it. The apartment was still quiet, the kind of silence that carried weight rather than peace. Noah Brooks sat at the small kitchen table already dressed for school, his backpack resting beside him like a reminder of structure he was still learning to trust. Daniel poured a small cup of coffee, black and simple, then set a plate of toast in front of his son without asking unnecessary questions. Noah ate slowly, his eyes occasionally drifting toward the window as if expecting something unspoken to appear outside. Daniel noticed, but he did not press. He had learned that silence in children was not always absence. Sometimes it was processing. The morning radio played softly in the background, weather updates for a city that never paused long enough to listen. Daniel checked his phone once. No new assignments. No messages from the hotel. But the memory of the Whitmore Grand Hotel still lingered in a way that felt unresolved, like a door left slightly open. Across the city, Charlotte Whitmore stood in her private office high above the skyline. Floor-to-ceiling glass framed the entire city as if it were part of her property. She reviewed financial projections, acquisition summaries, and board updates with mechanical precision. Yet every few minutes, her attention drifted briefly toward a small internal report she had not expected to care about. Noah had not spoken much at breakfast. That detail stayed with her longer than she allowed herself to admit. She told herself it was nothing. Routine adjustment. Children changed. Patterns shifted. Still, she found herself recalling the maintenance worker from the hotel corridor, the way he had moved without seeking attention, the way Noah had looked at him without hesitation. That combination did not fit easily into any category she trusted. At school drop-off, Noah stepped out of the black SUV without looking back immediately. Charlotte lowered the window slightly. "Have a good day," she said, voice controlled, precise. Noah paused. Then, quietly, almost as if the words were not entirely meant for her, he replied, "I think I will." And then he walked away. Charlotte remained still for a moment longer than necessary, watching him disappear through the school entrance. Something about his tone felt unfamiliar. Not defiant. Not distant. Just, different. Daniel arrived at his maintenance facility shortly after, greeting no one in particular as he moved toward his assigned section. The building hummed with industrial consistency, pipes, systems, and machinery all performing their expected roles without emotional interference. That was what Daniel preferred about it. Systems were honest. People were not always so simple. Midway through the morning, he was called to inspect a secondary cooling line connected to an external client system. The assignment was routine, but the location appeared on the dispatch screen with unusual priority. Whitmore-affiliated property. Daniel paused for a fraction of a second before accepting. He did not allow assumptions to form, but something in the timing felt connected in a way he could not yet explain. When he arrived, the system access point had already been cleared for him. The facility was quieter than the hotel, but carried the same polished structure designed to project control. As he worked, he noticed subtle inconsistencies in the system logs again. Not failures. Adjustments. Recent ones. Intentional. Then he noticed it. A child security clearance tag had been logged through the system within the last 24 hours. That was not standard procedure for maintenance zones. Daniel's movements slowed slightly. He checked the log again. The same result. Behind him, a supervisor passed through briefly, offering no explanation. "Just routine audit adjustments," the man said casually, continuing down the hall. But Daniel understood enough about routine systems to recognize when something had been quietly modified beyond routine. He closed the panel carefully, his expression unchanged. Yet internally, the observation remained unresolved, forming a quiet tension he did not ignore but also did not escalate. Meanwhile, Charlotte sat in a boardroom meeting that required her full attention. Presentations unfolded across digital screens, numbers and forecasts aligning with expected outcomes. Yet her mind occasionally drifted back to Noah's earlier tone, the slight change in his silence, the way he had answered her as if he had learned something she had not taught him. After the meeting, she dismissed her team earlier than scheduled. Alone in her office, she reviewed security logs from the hotel stay again, though she could not explain why she was doing so. Daniel Brooks' name appeared once more in system documentation tied to maintenance clearance. She studied it briefly, then closed the file. Outside her office, the city continued its constant movement. Inside, for the first time in a long time, Charlotte Whitmore felt something subtle shift beneath her control. Not disruption. Not alarm. Awareness without explanation. And somewhere across the city, Daniel Brooks stood in front of a sealed maintenance panel, unaware that his presence had already begun to register in places he had never intended to enter. Daniel Brooks moved through the maintenance facility that afternoon with the same steady rhythm he always carried, but the city around him felt slightly different, as if something unseen had shifted its weight. The assignment list on his handheld device was longer than usual, yet none of it explained the strange consistency he had been noticing across systems tied indirectly to Whitmore-affiliated properties. He did not speak about it. Men like him rarely did. Instead, he worked. Pipes, filters, cooling lines, mechanical checks. Each task was completed with precision learned through years of repetition and responsibility. But beneath the routine, his attention kept returning to patterns he could not fully ignore. Adjustments logged without proper authorization. Access points opened and closed at unusual intervals. Not failures. Not accidents. Decisions made somewhere above his level of visibility. Meanwhile, across the city, Charlotte Whitmore sat in her office reviewing internal reports that no longer felt purely administrative. Noah had returned from school quieter than usual, and although he had not misbehaved or resisted instructions, something in his presence felt subtly shifted. He answered questions more slowly, as if weighing responses that once came automatically. Charlotte attributed it, at least outwardly, to routine childhood development. Yet internally, she found herself returning to the same unanswered detail. The maintenance worker at the hotel. The way Noah had looked at him without hesitation. The way he had not responded with fear or awe, but with something unfiltered and immediate. She told herself it was irrelevant. Still, she opened the security overview from the hotel system again, scrolling further than necessary. Daniel Brooks' clearance record appeared again in a maintenance log linked to secondary systems. Nothing official flagged him as important. Nothing elevated his role beyond standard staff classification. Yet the repetition of his presence across unrelated points of infrastructure created a pattern she could not unsee once noticed. She closed the file, then reopened it seconds later, as if confirming her own curiosity against logic. Noah arrived home that evening and placed his backpack down without speaking immediately. Charlotte observed him from across the room, noting the slight delay before he responded to her greeting. "How was school?" she asked, maintaining a calm tone designed not to pressure. "Fine," he replied after a pause. But the word carried less weight than usual. Charlotte approached slowly, sitting across from him at the dining table. "Did something happen today?" Noah hesitated. His eyes drifted briefly toward the window before returning to her. "I thought about the man from the hotel again," he said. Charlotte did not respond immediately. Instead, she studied him with the careful attention she used in negotiations where every detail mattered. "Why?" she asked finally. Noah considered the question as if it required translation. "Because he did not try to make me feel small," he said quietly. The statement lingered in the room longer than either of them expected. Charlotte leaned back slightly, her expression controlled but less certain than before. "People are not trying to make you feel anything," she replied, though her voice lacked its usual finality. Noah nodded, but not in agreement. More like acknowledgement of a difference between what he felt and what he was being told. Later that night, Daniel returned home after completing his final assignment. Noah was already asleep on the couch, one arm hanging loosely over a folded blanket. Daniel stood for a moment before him, observing the calm rise and fall of his breathing. He noticed the school folder partially open on the table, papers slightly misaligned, as if left in a hurry. He did not touch them immediately. Instead, he set down his toolbox quietly and moved to the kitchen, pouring a glass of water. The silence in the apartment felt different tonight. Not empty. Just suspended. He eventually picked up the folder and glanced at the top page. A school notice, routine attendance report, nothing unusual at first glance. But as he turned it slightly under the light, a faint mark caught his attention. A system stamp consistent with administrative software used in high-security facilities. The kind he had seen earlier in the week during the maintenance inspection. He paused, then closed the folder carefully and placed it back where it was. Something was connecting, though not yet clearly enough to name. Across the city, Charlotte stood alone in her office once more, city lights reflecting across the glass walls like distant signals she could not interpret. Noah's words echoed in her mind longer than she expected. Not fear. Not admiration. Something else entirely. And somewhere in that quiet overlap of lives that should not have crossed so easily, the shape of a larger question began to form, still incomplete, still waiting for the moment it would finally reveal itself. The next morning arrived with a colder edge over Chicago, as if the city itself had absorbed the quiet tension building beneath its surface. Daniel Brooks was already at work before most of the city had fully woken, moving through a commercial facility connected to a broader network of Whitmore-managed properties. The assignment sheet labeled it as routine infrastructure maintenance, yet nothing about the recent patterns Daniel had observed felt routine anymore. He checked connections, verified system flows, and documented readings with steady discipline. His hands were calm, but his attention was not. Somewhere in the back of his mind, the inconsistencies from the hotel, the school system mark on Noah's paperwork, and the overlapping access logs began to form a shape that did not yet have a name. He paused briefly near a control panel, reading a secondary authorization line that had been updated within the last 48 hours. The signature was generic, but the timing aligned too closely with everything else he had seen. Daniel closed the panel without comment. He had learned long ago that noticing too much could create problems for men who were not supposed to matter in rooms like this. Meanwhile, across the city, Charlotte Whitmore sat in a glass-enclosed conference room surrounded by executives discussing expansion strategies and market forecasts. She listened, responded when necessary, and maintained her reputation for precision. Yet beneath that exterior, her focus drifted in quiet interruptions she could not fully control. Noah's behavior had not returned to what she considered normal. He was not distressed, not disobedient, just different in a way that resisted her usual explanations. She found herself recalling fragments rather than facts. The maintenance worker at the hotel. The way Noah had spoken about him. The absence of fear in that brief interaction. After the meeting concluded, Charlotte remained seated longer than necessary, staring at the city skyline through the reinforced glass. Her assistant spoke softly near the door, waiting for dismissal instructions, but Charlotte did not respond immediately. Instead, she opened her tablet again and accessed a restricted internal report from Whitmore Grand Hotel Operations. Daniel Brooks' name appeared once more in maintenance activity logs, now connected indirectly to multiple access points across different facilities. It was not unusual for staff to appear in logs. What was unusual was the repetition without narrative context. He appeared, performed tasks, and left no administrative footprint beyond necessity. Efficiency without visibility. That pattern unsettled her more than she expected. She closed the file and finally dismissed her assistant. Noah returned home that afternoon earlier than usual due to a school schedule adjustment. Charlotte noticed immediately that he did not rush to speak. Instead, he placed his bag down carefully and stood near the window, watching the city below as if trying to understand it from a distance. "Did something happen today?" she asked gently, setting aside her tablet. Noah hesitated, then shook his head slightly. "No," he said, but the word felt incomplete. Charlotte studied him more closely now, the way she might study a shifting market trend that refused to stabilize. "You are thinking about something," she said. Noah finally turned toward her. His voice was quiet, but steady. "The man from the hotel. I think he knew I was not okay even before I did." Charlotte's expression tightened subtly, not in rejection, but in calculation. "That is not possible," she replied. But even as she said it, the certainty in her tone felt slightly rehearsed. Noah did not argue. He simply sat down at the edge of the couch, still holding on to the thought as if it had weight. "He did not fix anything," he added. "He just stayed still." And it helped. The room grew quiet in a way that felt different from silence. Charlotte looked away briefly toward the city beyond the glass, then back at her son. Something inside her resisted the simplicity of what he was describing. Yet another part of her could not dismiss the consistency of his reaction. Across town, Daniel finished his shift and stepped outside into late afternoon air. The wind carried the faint sound of distant traffic, layered with construction noise from nearby streets. He checked his phone, confirmed his next assignment, and started walking toward the train station. His thoughts remained anchored to systems and patterns, but now those systems felt less isolated than before. There was overlap forming between places that should not have been connected. He stopped briefly at a crosswalk, waiting for the light to change. For a moment, he thought again about the child's eyes in the hotel corridor. Not curiosity. Not fear. Recognition of something unspoken. The light changed and he moved forward, unaware that the same pattern he had begun to notice was already being studied from a higher floor of a glass tower across the city. And for the first time, the distance between those separate worlds felt slightly thinner than before. Charlotte Whitmore did not sleep well that night, although she would never admit it aloud. Her penthouse remained perfectly arranged as always, city lights reflecting across glass surfaces like controlled constellations, but her mind moved in a less controlled pattern. She stood near the window for several minutes before dawn, holding a cup of untouched coffee, watching Chicago slowly transition from darkness into structure. Noah's words from earlier in the week continued to replay in fragments she could not fully dismiss. Not because they were dramatic, but because they were simple. Simplicity, in her experience, was often the most difficult thing to interpret correctly. At precisely 7:30 in the morning, Noah was ready for school earlier than usual. Charlotte noticed immediately that he was more composed than the previous day, yet also more distant. He ate breakfast without complaint, adjusted his backpack without assistance, and walked beside her toward the vehicle without looking back at the apartment. "You are quiet again," Charlotte said as they reached the black SUV waiting outside. Noah paused briefly before answering. "I am thinking," he said. Charlotte nodded once, as if accepting the explanation, though internally she registered it as another shift she could not categorize. The driver closed the door and the vehicle merged into early traffic. Across the city, Daniel Brooks arrived at a smaller commercial site on the west side, where maintenance responsibilities overlapped with administrative oversight for multiple corporate clients. The environment was familiar: fluorescent lighting, steel fixtures, the steady hum of machinery performing predictable cycles. He preferred environments like this. Systems that followed rules were easier to understand than people who did not. Yet as he moved through the facility, verifying cooling distribution units, he noticed a new access authorization logged into the shared network. It was not unusual for corporate systems to update permissions overnight, but this one carried a subtle inconsistency in its timestamp alignment. Daniel paused, scanning the entry again. Whitmore Integrated Network Protocol. The same name appeared across multiple systems now, not directly connected but structurally similar enough to suggest coordination. He did not speak to anyone about it. Instead, he documented it quietly, as he always did, then continued working. Meanwhile, Charlotte arrived at her office tower and stepped directly into a morning briefing with her executive team. The discussion revolved around expansion, acquisitions, and operational efficiency. She participated as expected, offering precise responses, maintaining control of tone and direction. Yet during a brief pause in the presentation, her attention drifted again toward internal system analytics she had requested the previous night. Daniel Brooks' name appeared once more, indirectly linked through maintenance access trails across different facilities. There was no misconduct. No violation. Only repetition. Patterns without explanation often meant nothing in corporate systems. But Charlotte had built her career on recognizing when nothing was not actually nothing. After the meeting, she dismissed her team and remained alone in her office longer than scheduled. The glass walls framed the city below like a controlled simulation of movement and order. She opened a restricted personnel file again, scrolling slowly through maintenance logs. Noah's school had submitted a routine report that morning confirming his attendance and behavioral stability. Yet even that felt slightly misaligned with what she had observed. She closed the file, then reopened it. Daniel Brooks. The name remained unchanged, but its presence across unrelated systems now felt less accidental than before. Charlotte leaned back in her chair, exhaling slowly. She did not like questions without immediate answers. Across town, Noah sat in his classroom, looking out the window during a brief pause between lessons. His teacher spoke softly nearby, but his attention drifted elsewhere. He was not thinking about assignments or instructions. He was thinking about stillness. Not silence as absence, but silence as something that could hold meaning. Daniel Brooks had not told him anything unusual. He had simply been present for a moment that felt different from everything else around him. At lunchtime, Noah wrote something in his notebook, then quickly closed it when another student looked over his shoulder. He did not explain it to anyone. Not even himself. Daniel finished his shift in the late afternoon and exited the facility through a side entrance, the air outside cooler than expected. He checked his phone, noting a minor schedule change for the following day. As he walked toward the transit station, he felt the same underlying tension that had been present for days now, subtle but persistent. Systems were beginning to overlap in ways that were not yet visible in full, but already too consistent to ignore. He stopped briefly at a corner, watching traffic move in steady cycles. Then, without warning, his phone vibrated with a new assignment notification. The location displayed was not unfamiliar. Whitmore Affiliated Property, Executive Division Access Zone. Daniel read it once, then lowered the device without reaction. He had no reason yet to question it openly. But as he continued walking, something inside him registered the shift. Not urgency. Not danger. Just the quiet confirmation that separate paths were beginning to converge in ways none of them had fully realized. Charlotte Whitmore arrived at the Whitmore Grand Hotel earlier than scheduled, though she had not planned to revisit the location so soon. The decision had not been emotional, at least not in her mind. It was procedural. A discrepancy in internal logs had been flagged by her assistant overnight, and Charlotte had authorized a personal review. That was all. The hotel lobby looked identical to how she remembered it. Marble floors reflecting soft gold lighting, staff moving with controlled efficiency, guests entering and exiting as if guided by invisible structure. Yet today, her attention was not on the environment. It was on patterns. Daniel Brooks' name appeared again in the updated maintenance access report she had requested. This time, the system flagged a secondary authorization trail linked to executive zone adjustments. Nothing improper. Nothing explicit. But unusual enough to justify her presence. She stood near the reception desk for a moment longer than necessary, reviewing the report on her tablet. Her expression remained composed, but her focus had narrowed. Noah stood beside her, holding his backpack strapped loosely, observing the space without speaking. He had not been told why they were here. Charlotte preferred to maintain control over information flow, especially when she did not fully understand the situation herself. "We will not be long," she said softly. Noah nodded, but his eyes were already scanning the lobby. There was a subtle tension in his posture, not discomfort, but anticipation. Across the building, Daniel Brooks had already been assigned to a new maintenance task in the executive corridor. He moved through the service elevator alone, toolbox resting at his feet, the hum of machinery surrounding him like familiar silence. His phone had displayed the assignment earlier than usual, marked priority level without explanation. That alone would have been enough for him to proceed without question. He had learned not to question systems that did not offer answers. When the elevator doors opened, the executive corridor stretched ahead in clean lines of glass and polished steel. Daniel stepped out, adjusting his grip on the toolbox, and began walking toward the assigned panel. It was near the same section he had worked in before, though the environment felt slightly altered, as if something had been recalibrated without visible notice. Then he noticed it. A secondary access point was active in the corridor, one that should have been restricted during maintenance hours. The indicator light was steady, not blinking, which meant continuous authorization. Daniel paused briefly, observing the system. Something felt wrong, but not in a way that suggested failure. In a way that suggested oversight. Meanwhile, Charlotte and Noah moved through the lower corridor with a hotel supervisor guiding them toward a private observation lounge. Charlotte's presence required no announcement. Staff simply adjusted their paths instinctively. Noah walked slightly behind her now, still silent, still observing. As they approached the glass corridor that separated public and executive sections, Noah stopped suddenly. Charlotte turned immediately. "What is it?" she asked. Noah did not answer at first. His gaze was fixed beyond the glass partition, toward the maintenance corridor on the other side. Daniel was visible now, though partially obscured by structural framing, standing beside an open panel, focused entirely on his work. Noah's voice was quiet when it came. "He is here again." Charlotte followed his line of sight. Her expression remained controlled, but her attention sharpened instantly. She recognized the maintenance worker from the hotel logs, though seeing him physically within proximity of executive access zones created a new layer of inconsistency she had not anticipated. Daniel did not look up. He continued working, unaware of being observed. Noah stepped closer to the glass without thinking. Charlotte noticed immediately. "Stay here," she said gently, but her tone carried authority beneath the softness. Noah hesitated, then stopped, but his eyes remained fixed. In the maintenance corridor, Daniel tightened a connection inside the panel, unaware of the observation occurring just meters away. Yet something in the environment felt subtly different. A presence without interaction. He slowed his movements briefly, then resumed, maintaining focus. Charlotte stood still, studying the scene longer than she intended. The logs. The patterns. The repetition. And now physical proximity. None of it confirmed anything specific, but together it created a structure she could not yet interpret. Noah spoke again, barely above a whisper. "He is not pretending," he said. Charlotte did not respond immediately. The statement did not fit within her framework of logic or observation. Daniel finished the adjustment and closed the panel, exhaling quietly before stepping back. He finally turned slightly, not toward them directly, but enough that his gaze passed across the corridor space. For a fraction of a second, the distance between them felt less defined, though no words were exchanged. Charlotte instinctively adjusted her posture, reasserting control over her expression. "We are leaving," she said to Noah. But Noah did not move right away. He continued watching Daniel until the maintenance worker turned away and walked deeper into the corridor, disappearing beyond the glass partitions. Only then did Noah follow his mother. As they walked toward the exit, Charlotte's mind remained active, processing, categorizing, attempting to resolve the inconsistency. But no resolution came. Only accumulation. And behind them, unseen by either, Daniel Brooks continued his work, unaware that observation had shifted into recognition, and recognition into something neither system nor silence had fully defined yet. Charlotte Whitmore did not speak during the ride back from the Whitmore Grand Hotel. The black SUV moved through Chicago traffic with controlled precision, each stoplight reflecting briefly across the tinted windows like passing fragments of thought she refused to name. Noah sat beside her, quieter than usual, his hands folded over his backpack strap, his gaze fixed on nothing in particular yet not empty. Charlotte checked her tablet once, then closed it without reading further. The executive report she had opened no longer felt useful. Daniel Brooks' presence in the system logs had reached a threshold that was no longer explainable through routine maintenance patterns alone. Not because of what he had done, but because of where he appeared without expectation. Across the city, Daniel Brooks continued his shift at a secondary Whitmore-affiliated facility, unaware that his name had already crossed into conversations far beyond his assignment level. He moved through the mechanical corridor with steady discipline, inspecting units, tightening connections, and verifying system flow as he always did. Yet the awareness of inconsistency had not left him. It followed quietly in the background of every task, like a signal just beneath audible range. He paused at one junction panel, reading the updated configuration again. The access hierarchy had changed overnight. Not dramatically. Subtly. Enough to shift responsibility without announcement. Daniel exhaled slowly, closed the panel, and moved on. He did not question aloud what he could not yet confirm. Later that evening, Charlotte sat alone in her office long after her team had left. The city outside had transitioned into its nighttime rhythm, light stretching across glass surfaces like quiet signals of continuity. She replayed the corridor moment in her mind again, not as emotion, but as structure. Noah's reaction. The maintenance worker's absence of performance. The system logs that refused to align into a single explanation. Her assistant had already provided a summary report, but it offered no clarity beyond confirmation of anomalies. Charlotte leaned back in her chair, staring at the ceiling for a moment before opening a restricted file once more. Daniel Brooks. Maintenance technician. No notable incidents. No disciplinary records. No elevation history. A profile so unremarkable that its repetition across sensitive access points should not have been possible. Yet there it was again. Consistent. Reappearing in contexts that did not match his classification. She closed the file and stood, walking toward the window. Below her, Chicago continued moving without awareness of internal shifts occurring inside corporate systems above it. Noah was already asleep at home, though Charlotte had checked on him twice before leaving the residence. Even in sleep, his expression remained slightly altered, as if something had settled inside him that had not fully resolved. At the maintenance facility, Daniel completed his final inspection of the night. The system cycle stabilized under his adjustments, returning to expected operational range. He documented the result, signed off, and prepared to leave. As he stepped outside, the air felt colder than earlier, sharper against his skin. He paused briefly before walking toward the transit line. His phone vibrated once. A system notification from Whitmore Integrated Access Network. Not an assignment. Not a correction. A review request. Unusual at his level. Daniel looked at the notification longer than he normally would. Then he put the phone away and continued walking. He did not yet know why the system was beginning to respond differently to his presence. He only knew that it was. Meanwhile, Charlotte remained at her window, watching the city without focusing on any single point. For the first time, she did not attempt to categorize what she could not immediately understand. Instead, she allowed the uncertainty to exist without resolution. And somewhere between structured systems and unclassified behavior, between silence and observation, the distance between their worlds continued to narrow without permission or announcement. The next morning began with an unusual stillness inside the Whitmore corporate tower. Charlotte Whitmore arrived earlier than her executive team, her presence alone enough to shift the atmosphere of the glass-walled office floor. She did not speak much as she moved through her space, only acknowledging brief greetings with subtle nods. Her focus, however, was not on the upcoming board briefing. It was elsewhere, fixed on a decision she had not yet fully justified even to herself. Across the city, Daniel Brooks stood in the early light of a maintenance corridor, unaware that his name had already been escalated beyond his operational level. He adjusted his tool belt and reviewed the assignment notification that had arrived overnight. It was different from the others. Not a task. Not a correction. A request labeled as System Verification Review, originating from executive oversight. He stared at it for a moment longer than usual. Men like Daniel were not often pulled upward in systems they were never meant to interact with. He understood that much. Still, he did not refuse. He simply followed procedure. Meanwhile, Noah Whitmore sat in a private room adjacent to Charlotte's office, waiting quietly as her assistant prepared him for what was described as a short meeting before school activities. Noah did not ask questions. He had stopped asking unnecessary questions days ago, not because he lacked curiosity, but because answers had started feeling incomplete. Charlotte entered the room moments later. She looked at her son carefully, noticing again the subtle distance in his expression. "You will stay here for a short while," she said gently. Noah nodded. "Is it about the man from the hotel?" he asked. Charlotte paused for a fraction of a second before responding. "It is about understanding context," she replied, choosing words carefully. Noah did not respond further, but his silence carried attention rather than withdrawal. Daniel arrived at the designated executive access corridor later that morning. It was not a place he had been assigned to frequently. The environment reflected a different layer of the organization, quieter, more controlled, almost removed from operational visibility. He stepped through security clearance without issue, though he noticed the increased presence of system monitors tracking movement in real time. He did not react. Instead, he proceeded to the designated terminal area where his verification task was scheduled. A supervisor he had never met before guided him briefly, offering minimal explanation. "Just system validation," the supervisor said. "Confirm structural consistency in access logs." Daniel nodded once. No further clarification was offered. Charlotte observed from a distance behind glass partitioning, not directly visible to the maintenance corridor but connected through monitoring displays. She did not expect to see anything unusual. This was, on paper, procedural. Yet her attention remained locked on the screen showing Daniel Brooks' entry into the system. Noah sat beside her in silence. He leaned slightly forward when Daniel appeared on the display feed. Charlotte noticed. "Do you recognize him?" she asked. Noah hesitated. "Not like before," he said quietly. Charlotte turned her gaze briefly toward him, but said nothing immediately. In the maintenance corridor, Daniel accessed the system terminal and began the verification process. The data stream displayed layered access logs, system adjustments, and authorization trails. As he reviewed them, a pattern emerged that did not belong to standard maintenance operations. The system was not failing. It was adapting. Quietly. Without formal escalation. He paused, reading a sequence of entries that linked multiple facilities under Whitmore Integrated Infrastructure. The connections were subtle but consistent. Adjustments that aligned too precisely across unrelated environments. He did not fully understand the purpose yet, but he understood enough to know it was intentional. Charlotte watched his movements through the monitoring feed. He did not behave like someone trying to prove anything. He behaved like someone confirming what already existed. Noah spoke again, softly. "He is not confused," he said. Charlotte did not respond immediately. That observation was not part of what she expected from her son. Daniel completed the verification sequence without error. The system stabilized after his input, recalibrating several minor inconsistencies automatically. A confirmation message appeared on the terminal, marking the review as complete. Yet Daniel did not leave immediately. He remained still for a moment, looking at the final line of system output. Something about it felt incomplete, not technically, but structurally. As if the system had been waiting for acknowledgement rather than correction. Charlotte stepped slightly closer to the glass, still unseen from his position. She studied him carefully now, not as a worker, but as a variable within a system she had not fully mapped. Noah stood beside her, eyes fixed on Daniel. Neither of them spoke. Daniel finally closed the terminal and stepped back, preparing to leave the corridor. But for a brief moment before turning away, he glanced toward the reflective surface of the glass partition. He did not see them clearly. Only shapes, presence, observation. Still, something about that moment lingered longer than it should have. Charlotte remained still after he left the frame. The system had been verified. The logs had been reviewed. Nothing officially changed. And yet, internally, she could not dismiss the feeling that something had shifted without permission, without announcement, and without resolution. Noah broke the silence first. "He knows," he said quietly. Charlotte looked at him sharply. "Knows what?" she asked. Noah did not answer. He simply looked back at the empty corridor where Daniel had stood moments earlier. And in that silence, Charlotte realized that for the first time, she was no longer certain whether she was observing the system, or whether something inside the system had already begun observing back. Charlotte Whitmore remained in the executive observation suite long after the system verification had concluded. The maintenance corridor where Daniel Brooks had stood was now empty, yet the image of his presence did not leave the screen in her mind. The monitors displayed standard confirmation logs, system stability restored, access review completed. Everything appeared correct on paper. That was what unsettled her most. Noah stood beside her, no longer speaking, his attention divided between the empty corridor feed and the reflection of his own thoughts. Charlotte finally stepped away from the glass partition and moved toward the central desk where the system summaries were displayed in real time. She reviewed the final verification report again. Daniel Brooks had completed the review without error, without deviation, without additional commentary. Yet across multiple logs, his presence had intersected with systems that were not meant to require human interpretation. She leaned slightly forward, narrowing her focus. He did not behave like someone guessing, she said quietly, more to herself than to anyone else. Noah responded without looking away from the screen. He did not feel like someone who was lost, he said. Charlotte turned toward him immediately. What does that mean? She asked. Noah hesitated, searching for words that did not fully belong to his age or understanding. It means he already knew where he was supposed to be before he got there, he said finally. The statement lingered in the air longer than expected. Charlotte did not dismiss it. Instead, she considered it with a level of attention she usually reserved for financial projections or structural risks. Across the city, Daniel Brooks had returned to transit after completing the verification assignment. He sat on the train in silence, toolbox resting at his feet, hands loosely folded. The city passed outside the window in blurred segments of light and structure. He replayed the system logs in his mind without meaning to. Not because they were complex, but because they were too organized in a way that suggested intention rather than maintenance necessity. Something in the architecture of the system felt layered, as if multiple decisions had been made without informing the people executing them. He closed his eyes briefly, then opened them again. He did not yet have enough information to form conclusion, but he had enough to recognize that what he had seen was not isolated. Meanwhile, Charlotte returned to her office later that afternoon, dismissing all non-essential meetings. She sat alone for several minutes before reopening the Whitmore Integrated System dashboard. Noah was not in the room, but his earlier words remained with her longer than she expected. She pulled up the consolidated access history again, filtering Daniel Brooks' entries across all associated facilities. The pattern remained consistent. Not random. Not erroneous. Structured repetition across multiple points of infrastructure that did not typically overlap. She leaned back slightly in her chair. For the first time, she did not attempt to immediately classify it. Instead, she observed it as it was. Unresolved. Noah arrived home earlier than usual that evening. Charlotte noticed immediately that he did not rush to speak or report anything about his day. He placed his backpack down carefully and stood near the window, looking outside as the city lights began to shift into evening rhythm. Do you think people can see things that others cannot? He asked suddenly. Charlotte turned toward him slowly. People interpret what they see based on information, she replied. Noah nodded slightly, but did not seem satisfied with the answer. I think he saw me before I said anything, he said. Charlotte paused. That is not possible, she replied automatically, though her tone lacked the certainty it once carried. Noah did not argue. He simply sat down on the edge of the couch, quiet again, as if the conversation itself had already reached its limit. Later that night, Daniel stood outside his apartment building, looking up briefly before entering. The air was colder than earlier, carrying the weight of approaching night. His phone vibrated once with a system update confirmation, marking completion of the executive review cycle. He checked it briefly, then put the phone away without reaction. Inside the apartment, the silence felt familiar, but not entirely unchanged. He placed his toolbox down and stood still for a moment longer than usual. Not because anything was wrong, but because something felt like it had been acknowledged without explanation. Across the city, Charlotte Whitmore remained at her desk long after office hours, staring at the same system logs that now refused to simplify themselves into anything familiar. And somewhere between structured data and unspoken recognition, the distance between observer and observed continued to collapse without either side fully naming what was happening. Charlotte Whitmore stood alone in her office long after midnight, the entire floor of Whitmore Tower emptied into silence that felt heavier than usual. The city outside continued its endless movement, but inside her glass-walled space, everything had slowed into something more deliberate. On her desk, multiple system reports remained open, all converging on the same unresolved pattern. Daniel Brooks. Maintenance technician. Repeated system presence across unrelated infrastructures. No violations. No anomalies that should have escalated attention. Yet the repetition itself had become the anomaly. She did not close the files this time. Instead, she leaned back in her chair, studying them not as data points, but as a sequence that refused to behave randomly. Noah's words echoed again in her mind, quieter now but no less persistent. He already knew where he was supposed to be before he got there. She had dismissed it earlier. Now she did not. Across the city, Daniel Brooks sat at the small table in his apartment, the lamp casting a warm circle of light over a life built on repetition and responsibility. Noah was already asleep in the next room, breathing evenly beneath a thin blanket, his backpack still resting near the bed as if tomorrow had not yet fully arrived. Daniel did not move for several minutes. His toolbox remained closed beside him, but his attention was not on it. It was on the system logs he had reviewed earlier in the week, the patterns that no longer behaved like isolated incidents. They now formed a structure that suggested coordination beyond maintenance operations. Not dangerous. Not visible. But intentional. He exhaled slowly, then closed the folder in front of him. He did not have enough information to draw conclusions, but he had enough to understand that silence was no longer empty. It was structured. The next morning, Charlotte arrived at Whitmore Tower earlier than her team again. This time, she bypassed her usual schedule entirely and requested a private audit of system-wide access flows connected to maintenance operations. Her request was precise, controlled, and unusually personal for someone in her position. She did not explain why. She did not need to. Noah sat in the adjacent lounge while she worked. He watched her quietly, noticing the difference in her movements compared to previous days. There was less certainty in her rhythm now, though she maintained outward control. "Are you trying to understand him?" Noah asked suddenly. Charlotte paused, her hand hovering over the screen. "I am trying to understand the system," she replied. Noah tilted his head slightly. "He is not inside the system," he said. The statement caused Charlotte to stop completely. She turned toward him slowly. "Then where is he?" she asked. Noah thought for a moment, then answered in a way that did not sound rehearsed. "Between things." Charlotte did not respond immediately. The phrase did not belong to operational language, yet it described the pattern more accurately than any report she had read. Meanwhile, Daniel was assigned to another Whitmore-affiliated site that afternoon. The location was smaller, less visible, but still connected to the broader network he had begun to recognize. As he worked through the system checks, he noticed something different. A feedback loop within the access structure had been modified again, this time with greater precision. It was not random adjustment. It was refinement. He paused, holding the diagnostic tool steady in his hand. This was no longer maintenance inconsistency. It was alignment. Not toward failure, but toward observation. He closed the panel slowly, then stood still for a moment longer than usual. He did not speak. He did not escalate. But internally, he acknowledged what had been forming across days of fragmented observation. The system was not just functioning. It was watching. That evening, Charlotte returned to her office and did something she had not done before. She isolated all entries connected to Daniel Brooks across every Whitmore system interface and overlaid them chronologically. The pattern that emerged was no longer subtle. It formed a continuous presence across time and location, intersecting with infrastructure nodes that should not have required human continuity. She leaned forward, her expression unchanged, but her focus absolute. Noah entered the room quietly and stood beside her without speaking. He looked at the screen for a long moment. He is not following the system, he said softly. Charlotte looked at him. Then what is he doing, she asked. Noah hesitated, then answered in the simplest way he could. He is standing where the system does not look. Charlotte did not respond. The room remained silent, but the silence now felt different. Not empty. Not passive. Structured, like everything else they had begun to notice. And somewhere across the city, Daniel Brooks closed another maintenance report without knowing that his presence was no longer being recorded as movement through a system, but as something far more difficult to classify. Observation without permission. Connection without contact. And a pattern that was no longer hidden, only waiting to be understood.